Hi everyone, Rudy here, and today I want to talk about how to best use your crafting materials to get the most out of them, because it does make a difference of when and what you choose to upgrade rare or when you reforge the legendaries. And I want to explain a little bit the thought process that goes into this. So first of all, you need to know that at the start of the season, it's very important to get up and running on T16 as fast as possible. So you want to gear for your meta build, and depending on what you get from the Helix gift, you might get some really bad stuff, and you want to get your main T16 build right away. This is the most important part, and you have to gear up fast to make sure that you transition into T16 right away, so that you can start farming at a decent efficiency level. So essentially, at the start, you want to use all of your materials for that goal. So you want to craft your set, you want to gamble your set, and you want to craft the remaining legendaries that the set needs to actually be viable. For example, for a multi-shot demon hunter, you want to get the unholy essence set. Usually you try to gamble that, and then you have the Yang's recurve, you have the Demon's legacy, and these are like the core pieces that you need to make this build work in T16. And the other stuff is kind of like whatever, like a Squirt's necklace helps, but you're not really going for that. A Nemesis bracer helps, but also you just wait for a drop. And for these core items, you really have to go for them, because they're like typically big multipliers, even bigger in some cases on other builds. And this is what you invest everything into at the start. And then later on in the season, when you're already geared, when you're farming and you want to prepare your push, this is where you want to use your materials in a very efficient way, because your materials are limited. So typically this means that you don't have infinite death breath, you don't have infinite forgotten souls, and with this you have like a limited amount of attempts to craft the items you need. So you want to use your brush shards and your materials the most effective way. And typically how it goes is that you try to get rid of all your forgotten souls with reforges. So one reforge is 50 souls. This means that for 1000 souls this is 20 reforges. For 10,000 souls is 200 reforges. And this also means you need a 1:10 ratio between your bounty materials and your forgotten souls. So typically you're signing up for around 5 to 10% of your playtime spent in bounties. And like this, you can typically get rid of your forgotten souls if you farm at decent efficiency levels. And this is very important to get the good items you need for the high tier push. The thing is that it's rather easy to gear up a character with like good non-ancient pieces, but if you want to compete on leaderboards, you need ancient items, you need to augment them, you need to have decent stuff to actually survive in most builds, because some builds are extremely squishy, and it just doesn't work when you don't have the gear. And the same with Death Breath. You use 25 Death Breath and 50 of each of the other 3 materials to upgrade one rare in the cube. And this means you need a 2:1 ratio between the normal materials and the Death Breath to make sure that you can use them all up. So typically a good source of normal materials is bounties. On bounties, when you do a full run, you get around 450 white and blue materials and 150 or so yellows. And when you do some rounds of bounties, you stack up these materials really fast. So this is typically how we get most of them. And also like in rifts, you just try to gather white and blue items so you can salvage them. So which items do you really want to craft now? And typically you want to upgrade rare items in slots that are rather difficult to get, because this is usually where you have the most trouble. Something like a pair of pants it usually just drops eventually. When you play a character for like 50 hours or 100 hours or so, you're almost guaranteed to get like a pair of unholy plates that has vitality and all-res, and this is the perfect stats, and there's not really much to it. On pants there's not really many possibilities for different stat rolls, and it just happens eventually. But you have something like gloss, for example, where you want the crit, you want the other crit, and then you want another stat, or in some cases you want a quad factor with no main stat. And gloss, for example, is one of the typical hard to get items as a good ancient, because you need to roll high values. You don't just need to get the crit damage, you also need to roll a high value. And then you also want like a high value of cooldown or melee damage or something like that. And it also needs to roll ancient. So this is like one of the more difficult to get items that first of all you want to gamble for, or you want to upgrade a rare with. Same thing with the shoulders, for example. Depends on the build a bit. Some builds don't really require anything. So it just typically comes down to whether you want area damage, whether you want skill damage on shoulders. So some builds don't really have big requirements, some builds have high requirements on shoulders. So for example, a Whirlwind Barbarian uses like really hard to get shoulders, and I didn't even get those, so I have these, but essentially I want to replace strength or auras for cooldown here. So I want 3 really good rolls, and then I want, you know, the main stat or something. So this is hard to get. But other shoulders, for example on Veers, it doesn't matter at all. So you just get whatever shoulders you have, and then you roll like 1 stat like cooldown, and that's it. So any shoulders almost is good, and you kind of have to you know, prioritize the hard to get items essentially. Same thing with boots or helm, for example, where you want to skill damage or you don't want skill damage. When you don't need skill damage, you just want like a basic vitality helm with crit. This is extremely easy to get. Almost every helm has that, or like 1 in 2 helms, let's say, will usually roll that stats. So essentially you need to understand how hard the item is to get. So recently I had my crafting Flavor of Time video, and Flavor of Time is like one of the most elusive items to roll well in this game. And the reason is there's a lot of stats that roll in Amulet, and you also need to roll really high values, for example like crit damage on the Amulet. If you get something like 60%, it's bad. So you need to get, you know, something like 85 plus or so to be considered good. And this makes it so hard to roll. So you typically invest most of your materials into that. And you also want to use your materials rather towards the end of the season. So essentially you get your build up and running, and you craft the most essential stuff. Maybe go for like an ancient weapon also, you know, try to weed out the really bad items at first. And after that you save up all your materials until you're ready to push, until you've farmed, you know, most of your ancient gear just from natural drops, from gambling. And you have the keys ready for the push, you have your augments ready for the push. And this is where you do your crafting session. So I did that recently on my wizard. So I had like 30k death breath, I had 1000 bounty mats, and I used it all. And this was after I've already gathered ancient pieces for almost every slot. So here's my wizard gear, for example. So this helm, it just dropped while I was farming keys. This chest, I think I gambled it. Then we had those shoulders, those were a drop. We had those boots, I tried to gamble for some boots and I got those, they're all right. Those gloves is actually what I gambled first, because the gloves were the hardest to get gambled item, and I actually got those at some point. And then we have also those pants that just drop eventually. And then those other materials I essentially spent entirely on rings and the weapon. So I managed to craft 2 Halo of Karinis. I'm not quite sure which one I'm going to use yet, but yeah, they're not really great, but they're alright. And then we have the weapon, which is this one here. So this is what I managed to craft with reforging, and it's pretty good. And this is also where like most of the materials went into. So the good thing about upgrading rares, that in some cases it's extremely easy to get certain items compared to other slots. So you kind of have to go for the right slots. First of all, those that are difficult to roll, and second of all, those that are easy to get with upgrade rare, because there's not many options. So you go to Defeat Planner /Kadala, and it will open this table here. And here you can see the average cost of, first of all, blood shards and also of death breath. And there are certain slots that are very easy to get. For example, on Demon Hunter, we have the one-hand daggers. So one-hand daggers, there's only 2 options. And this means that you need 50 death breath on average to get your ancient Kali's point, and you need only 500 death breath to get an ancient one. And of course, this is like the most extreme example here. But you can see that, you know, when you want to get a weapon for an Impale Demon Hunter, this is very nice to do. So you don't want to reforge your Kalis, you want to just upgrade rares because it's so easy to roll one. But for example, when you play a multi-shot Demon Hunter, then you need to invest 225 death breath on average to get your Yang's V-curve. So because Yang's is also relatively hard to roll, because of the legendary affix, you typically want to reforge that one, for example. Then you have the rings. Personally, I really like upgrading rings because there's a lot of options, and there's also a lot of like secondary rings that I might want to use for other builds, and that I just like to, you know, save up for whenever I switch my character or something. So you see, like the average cost of a ring is around 600, which is relatively high compared to most of these other slots. But for example, you have focus, you have restraint, you have compass rose, you have a convention. And then on some cases you have like class-specific rings, Elusive Ring for example, Halo of Karini, Crispin, and so on. And there's, you know, typically like 4 or 5 decent options, especially when you play multiple builds. So upgrading rings is pretty good, also because they cost 50 blood shards instead of 25. so it's relatively hard to gamble rings. I typically do that when I play on another class that is like already geared or that I don't intend to use for like a solo push. Then I typically gamble rings, so I can actually get like a little bit of stuff for my other builds. So essentially you have to play around the odds of getting the item at first, and then around getting the rolls that you want at second. And you have to kind of combine and estimate what you should go for, essentially. I'm not really calculating this, like I'm not mathing this out, what I should use my materials on, but you know, a gut feeling is usually good enough with some experience. Or just, you know, having the understanding of, you know, what item is hard to get and why it is hard to get. So we had this example of the Yang's V-curve here, and the good thing about Yang's is it always rolls with percent damage. It's like a fixed affix, so there's only one random primary, but you really need the discipline. Without discipline, the Yang's is useless. Even non-ancient Yang's can beat an ancient one when you don't have discipline and really bad damage roll. So you need the discipline, you need a high roll on the affix. So for example here, the perfect roll on the Yang's V-curve on the affix gives you plus 200% damage. So this means that with a 200% roll, you deal 300% total damage with multi-shot. This is like one multiply category. And now I'm missing 3% on the damage here, for example. And you have to understand how big this is. And this 3% means around 1% DPS loss, because my potential 300% maximum damage goes down to 297. And this difference is around 1% in overall damage done. So when you get something like a really good Yangtze curve with like the same damage value, but it has only a 160% affix, you lose around 40% from the affix. So this means something like a 13-14% DPS loss. So this is essentially like not having the percent damage roll, not having the attack speed roll. So you have to imagine this kind of weapon with a Yangtze V-curve with only 2 primaries. So you have to understand the overall value of the affixes. And another extreme example is the Halo of Carini. So I showed that already, but this is like, especially on defensive items, this is like one of those really extreme cases. So when you get a Halo of Carini with like less than 75% on the affix, that's essentially unusable because of how the toughness scales. When you have in a stack damage reduction, every point becomes extremely valuable the further you go, and the closer you are to a 100% damage reduction. So here, going from an 80% roll to a worse one like 75% already means a toughness loss of 20% because of how the math works. So when you have a ring like the Halo of Carini and you go from an 80% roll to a 75, then this means with the 25% toughness loss that you lose essentially like 2 or 3 primary rolls. So you have to imagine this ring with 2 or 3 primaries less. And in that case, it's unusable because, you know, no such ring would ever be good. And you have to try to keep going. So this is essentially how it goes. It depends a little bit on, you know, how much time you want to invest into your season. So just to give like some kind of like generic idea, I guess. So when you play a build that's rather easy to gear, then something like 50 hours is usually fine with like a little bit of upgrading, a little bit of bounties. When you play like a really hard to gear build, maybe 100 hours to up to like 150 hours with like efficient farming is necessary to get the items you want with the right rolls, with ancient, you know, or like not everything has to be ancient. Typically, it's, you know, very likely you have like a non-ancient amulet, very likely you have a non-ancient ring or something. But on some builds, it's important, especially LOD builds, you need those ancients. And it's just really hard to perform well and to compete when you don't have them. So this is kind of like the expected time frame that you should go for, and it depends a little bit on the build. You know, some builds require really specific roles. So for example, when you play Foreman Witch Doctor right now with the Barber, a Barber is extremely hard to roll because it doesn't have any fixed stats. So it needs to roll the high damage, it needs to roll the high affix, it needs to roll, you know, percent damage or attack speed, and then you want to roll the other one on top of it. So this is like one of these items that is extremely elusive. Even when you get a primary one, you're not really guaranteed to have a really good one. It's usually going to be fine because of the affix. It's going to be maxed, and then you can just roll like 10% damage or something. You have a max damage range, so it's not going to be bad. But you know, when you want to get a really good one, then even a primal will not always solve the problem here. And that's like another point about reforging is that on average you get 1 primal every 400 drops. So this means 400 reforges, which means 2,000 bounty mats and 20,000 souls. So this is the expected value. Of course, you can get lucky, you can get unlucky, but this is what it is. And primals really make it rather easy on some of these really hard to get items to actually roll the right stuff, because of your, damage range is maxed, your affix is maxed, or something like Carini, the affix matters a lot. So when you have the maxed Carini with a socket and like one other good stat, it's already pretty decent, but of course, you can get like the double crit and no main stat roll. But yeah, I didn't get that, but this is, what you're aiming for. But of course, this is so hard to roll that, yeah, typically you invest a lot of materials and you get kind of like something that you can begrudgingly use, even if it's non-ancient or something. But yeah, this is usually how it goes. So to summarize all of this, essentially at the start of the season, gamble, craft, use everything to get your T16 build up and running and your like low speed farm build up and running. Go for like the essential core pieces that need some good rolls. Maybe have some CDR requirements. Maybe want to really go for like an ancient weapon and so on at first. And after that, save your materials as long as possible. Unless you really need to replace some really crappy items, or you still have like this non-ancient pair of pants and it just won't drop, then yeah, go for it, but don't invest too much. Save up your materials as long as possible, and when you're ready with your augments, when you're ready for the push, when you feel like we want to stop the season, or you just don't want to keep grinding anymore, or you want to swap your character or something, then this is the time to craft, to get the remaining pieces, especially the hard to get ones, like the gloves, like rings, like the weapon, like the amulet. And then you just use your Death Breath first, upgrade stuff first, and after that you use the bounty materials. So just like a clear progression path essentially that you want to follow. One last tip for upgrading rares is, especially when you want to do it with weapons, try to collect them on the ground in T16 rifts. So you can find these weapons all the time. So when you pick up yellows here and there, you can get an eye for the items on the ground. So when I collect bows or whatever for Yang's V curve, I just pick them up and I save them in my stash, because like this you save the materials from crafting them at the blacksmith. Like with armor and rings and so on, you can just gamble or craft them at a jeweler, but crafting weapons specifically costs quite a lot of materials. It costs 15 of white, blue, and yellow, and this is a lot that you don't want to waste. So I know this was a lot of information here, but I hope you got the overall idea. And of course, some people just get lucky, some get unlucky. That's just how it is. Sometimes you have like an insane season and you just find 5 primals on the ground for your build, and then you have other seasons and you use everything and you get nothing. So this is just RNG, but overall it kind of averages out. When you play at least like 100+ hours or so in a season, because sometimes you get like a really good roll, sometimes you get a really bad roll, and you can typically get close to the maximum potential in terms of items in that time frame, I'd say. So depending on a build, you can get within like 1 or 2 tiers of the maximum. Maybe you might be missing like 1% crit here, maybe you're missing like 4% skill damage there, or your weapon needs like 7% more DPS, and your amulet might not have the elemental damage roll and so on. So it kind of adds up to like a 1 or 2 tier difference to what's like the perfect of like the best of the best gear. But you can get reasonably close without too much time and without too much investment. And that's basically the point I want to make. Try to figure out what you want to craft, and then use this information and try to get the most out of your character essentially. Yeah. I hope you liked this video here. I'll leave the link to the cadaver table in the description, and I'll see you guys next time.